The desert stretched endless and unforgiving, the horizon wavering under the blaze of the late afternoon sun. Heat shimmered off the sand like a living thing, curling and bending the world into mirages. The cowboy rode with steady rhythm, his horse's hooves muffled against the soft earth, his hat pulled low to shield his eyes from the merciless glare. He was a man used to silence, both around him and within. For years, he had chosen this emptiness over the risk of feeling again. The desert didn't ask questions. It didn't pry into the scars he carried, or the heart he had buried under layers of dust and steel. Out here, no one expected him to be more than a shadow moving across the wasteland. That was enough. At least, it had been. It was a flicker of movement that broke the stillness. At first, he thought it another mirage. The desert was full of tricks, cruel ones. But as his eyes sharpened, narrowing beneath the brim of his hat, he saw her. A woman, staggering across the sand, each step a battle against the sinking pull of exhaustion. Her hair hung loose and wild, strands plastered against her face by sweat. Her clothes were torn, faded once fine fabric now reduced to rags by wind and sun. She moved like someone who had been walking too long without water, her arms trembling, her knees buckling with each desperate stride. The cowboy reined in his horse, the animal tossing its head as if sensing the strangeness of the scene. He dismounted, boots crunching against the brittle ground. He didn't call out right away. People left to the desert were often left for a reason, and he wasn't a man who tangled with other folks' business lightly. But something about the tilt of her chin, even in ruin, stopped him from turning his back. She stood there, swaying, her eyes dark with defiance even as her lips cracked from thirst. She met his gaze and did not beg. That surprised him. Most in her state would have fallen to their knees, pleading for water, for mercy. But she looked at him as if daring him to walk away, daring him to be like the rest who had abandoned her. It was that fire, faint but alive in her eyes, that made his chest tighten against his will. He pulled the canteen from his saddlebag and held it out. Her hands trembled as she grasped it, but when the water touched her mouth she drank like someone pulling life back into their bones. She coughed, then steadied, drops of water running down her chin, darkening the dust on her throat. She stopped before draining it dry, as if remembering manners too deep to abandon, and handed it back with a nod that was almost regal. "You'll die out here," he said, his voice low, gravel rubbed raw by silence. Her lips parted, but her voice was hoarse when it came. "I've already been left to." The words cut sharper than a blade. He should have turned then, mounted his horse, and let her fate be her own. That was the safe choice. But instead, he found himself offering a hand. She hesitated, her pride a shield even in her weakness, but eventually her fingers touched his. He pulled her toward his horse, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. She let out a small sound, not quite pain, not quite surrender, and then settled into the saddle. He mounted behind her, his arm steadying her slight frame. The desert wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust. She leaned against him, her head brushing the edge of his shoulder. The contact was feather-light, yet it stirred something inside him that he had buried years ago. He told himself it was necessity. She was weak, she needed support, but the steady rhythm of her breathing against him was more than survival. It was dangerous. They rode in silence, the sun sinking low, painting the sky with streaks of blood and fire. He should have been thinking about where to take her, about how far the nearest town lay, about food and shelter. But instead, his thoughts tangled with questions he didn't want to ask. Who had cast her out? What crime, or what sin, could warrant leaving someone to die in the sand? He didn't ask because her silence was its own answer, and maybe because part of him feared the truth would only make her harder to let go. As the first stars bled through the purple sky, she shifted, murmuring words he almost didn't catch. "Why help me? You don't know me." He tightened his hold slightly, keeping her steady in the saddle. "Don't need to." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He already wanted to know her, more than he'd wanted to know anyone in a long, long time. Her presence pressed against him like a weight he hadn't expected, soft, fragile, alive. He had told himself long ago that his heart was buried deep enough no woman could ever find it again. Yet here she was, an outcast in tattered rags, and somehow she had unearthed it without even trying. By the time they stopped for the night, the desert was alive with shadows. He built a fire, its crackle the only sound between them. She sat across from him, knees pulled close, her face lit by the flames. For the first time, he saw her without the haze of heat and exhaustion. She was beautiful, not in the polished way of town women, but in the raw strength that shone through her weariness. She caught him looking, and for a heartbeat her guarded expression softened. He looked away, feeding another branch into the fire, but his chest burned hotter than the flames. He had saved her life, yes. But he knew the truth already. Somewhere between the moment he handed her the canteen and the moment she leaned her head against his shoulder, she had stolen something from him. Something he thought he'd buried forever in the silence of the desert. She had stolen his heart. And he wasn't sure he wanted it back. The desert air cooled with the fall of night, the heat of the day bleeding out of the sand until only shadows and silver light remained. The cowboy crouched near the small fire he had built, its orange glow flickering against the canyon walls, painting jagged teeth into the stone. He moved with the unhurried patience of a man who had learned to survive by doing things steady, one at a time. He poured water into a dented pot, dropped in dried beans and jerky, and set it above the flames. He didn't speak, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't trust words anymore. Words had failed him once, in a life he no longer allowed himself to remember. Now, silence was safer. The woman sat wrapped in his long coat, the fabric swallowing her frail frame, making her look smaller, though there was nothing small about the fire in her eyes. Dust streaked her face, but beneath the grime he could see the shape of someone who had carried more sorrow than she deserved. Her hands, trembling at first, now steadied as the warmth from the coat seeped into her bones. She hadn't asked him who he was, hadn't questioned why he helped. She only sat there, eyes trained on him, as if watching him was proof she had not been abandoned again. She spoke first, her voice raw from thirst, but soft, carrying like the wind in canyon hollows. She told him pieces of herself, not all at once but in fragments, like glass broken on stone. She had been cast out by those who should have protected her, judged too harshly by a world that loved to forget mercy. She had walked until her feet bled, carrying nothing but her shame and the stubborn refusal to lay down in the sand and die. He listened, his face unreadable, the firelight flickering across the shadow of his jaw and the deep lines carved into his skin. Her words slowed, then faltered. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in his coat, her voice trembling as she admitted what she feared most. Not the desert, not the hunger, not the men who had turned their backs on her, but the thought of being unseen, unloved, forever. That struck something in him, a buried ache that pressed against the walls he had built inside. He didn't move at first, didn't speak, he wasn't sure he remembered how. But when she shifted closer, inching toward the fire and toward him, she leaned against him as naturally as if she'd been waiting for him all her life. He stiffened, every muscle tight, heart hammering with a wildness he hadn't felt in years. Her head rested against his chest, listening to the slow thunder of his heartbeat. He thought of pushing her away, of reminding himself she wasn't his to keep, that he had buried his heart deep in the desert long ago. But the weight of her against him broke something open. His hand, rough and scarred, twitched at his side before he let it rise, hesitating, then settling gently across her shoulder. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask for words. She simply stayed. The fire cracked, sparks floating up into the night as the stars stretched endlessly above. The canyon seemed to listen, holding their silence like a secret. For the first time in years, the cowboy's silence wasn't armor, it was a shelter, a space she could breathe in. She sighed, soft and weary, and he felt the sound through his chest. Her breathing steadied, sinking with his, and he knew that without realizing it, she had stolen something he thought he had buried forever. The desert was harsh, merciless to the weak, but it had brought her to him, and in her, he saw not weakness but survival. She was an outcast, yes, but so was he. Two exiles, carved hollow by the same ruthless land, finding in each other the one thing neither thought they'd have again, belonging. He stared into the fire, his hand still resting on her shoulder, the heat of her body seeping into his side. The silence stretched long, but it wasn't empty. It was full, of things unspoken, of wounds unseen, of a promise neither dared to name. And though he had sworn to bury his heart in the desert, that night it beat again, fragile but alive, because of the woman sleeping softly against him. The first time she saw the children up close, it was by accident. She had just finished hauling a basket of laundry to the line, her arms aching from the weight of wet clothes. The wind tugged at the sheets she pinned, snapping them like sails, and for a moment she let herself enjoy the simple rhythm of the task. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed movement at the edge of the yard. Two small figures stood half hidden behind the corner of the house. A boy, tall for his age but thin as a reed, clutched the porch rail, his knuckles white. Beside him, a little girl with tangled hair peered around his leg, her white eyes fixed on the stranger who had taken up residence in their world. The woman stilled, her hand frozen on the clothespin. She had known the rancher had children. She had seen them dart past the windows at night, heard their laughter carried faintly on the wind. But until now, they had kept their distance, ghosts haunting the edges of her new life. She forced a smile, though her heart thudded nervously. "Hello," she said softly, careful not to startle them. The boy's grip tightened on the railing. His jaw set in a stubborn line, the same kind she often saw on his father. He didn't answer. The girl, though, tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her small face. For a moment, the woman thought she might step forward, but the boy's hand held her back. The unspoken message was clear: stay away. Her smile faltered, but she nodded as though she understood. "That's all right," she murmured. "I'll be here if you decide you want to talk." For the next few days, she caught glimpses of them, at the edge of the barn while she milked the cow, perched on the fence while she carried buckets of feed. Always watching, never approaching. Their father didn't press them, and neither did she. Children, she knew, needed time to trust. Still, every glance reminded her of the question that had been planted in her heart the day he asked, "Can you be a mother?" She had no answer. She had never known what it was to cradle a child of her own. Yet something about those two watchful faces stirred a longing in her, a fierce ache to belong to them as much as to this land. It happened one afternoon when the rancher was out riding the pasture fences. She was sweeping the porch when she heard a small sniffle. Turning, she saw the little girl sitting on the steps, her cheeks wet with tears. The boy was nowhere in sight. For a long moment, the woman stood frozen, afraid that if she moved too quickly the child would bolt. But the girl didn't run. She just sat there, shoulders trembling, eyes downcast. Gently, she set the broom aside and lowered herself onto the step, leaving space between them. "What's the matter, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice soft. The girl scrubbed her face with her sleeve, refusing to look at her. The silence stretched so long the woman thought she might never answer. Then, in a tiny whisper, the words slipped out. "I miss Mama." Her heart broke at the raw simplicity of it. She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "I know you do. That kind of missing never really goes away." The girl glanced at her then, just a flicker, as if weighing whether this stranger could understand. She reached down, plucked a dandelion that had grown between the steps, and twisted it in her fingers. "Papa says Mama's with God now." The woman drew in a careful breath. "He's right. And she loved you very much. I think she'd be glad to see how brave you are." The girl's lip trembled, but she didn't cry again. Instead, she set the dandelion in the woman's lap, as though offering a fragile token of trust. The woman's chest tightened. She picked it up gently, twirling the stem between her bandaged fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll keep it safe." That was the beginning. From then on, the girl began to shadow her quietly, slipping into the kitchen while she cooked, watching intently as she kneaded dough or stirred stew. At first, she didn't speak, but little by little the questions came. "Why do you roll the bread that way? Can I help?" The woman welcomed her eagerly, letting her dust the flour across the counter or sprinkle salt with careful fingers. It wasn't long before the girl's laughter filled the kitchen again, bright and sweet like a bell. The boy was slower to thaw. He lingered on the edges, his eyes wary, his arms crossed. One evening, when she offered him a slice of fresh bread, he shook his head and muttered, "We don't need you." The words cut, sharper than he knew, but she only smiled gently. "Maybe not, but I'm here anyway." It was his sister who finally bridged the gap. One day she ran to him, clutching a cookie the woman had helped her bake. "Try it," she insisted, holding it up to his mouth. He tried to resist, but her determination wore him down. With a reluctant bite, his eyes widened despite himself. She laughed, clapping her hands, and the woman caught the briefest flicker of a smile tugging at his lips. He didn't thank her, but he didn't glare as fiercely after that. The rancher noticed the change. One evening, as the woman sat on the porch mending clothes, he came to stand beside her. The children were chasing fireflies in the yard, their laughter carrying on the warm night air. He watched them for a long while, his face unreadable. Then, quietly, he said, "They're laughing again. Been a long time since I heard that." She looked up at him, startled by the softness in his voice. "They're good children," she said simply. His eyes met hers, steady and searching. "It ain't easy, stepping into a life that's already broken. But you've done more than work here. You've given them something I couldn't." Her throat tightened. She wanted to protest, to tell him she had done nothing extraordinary. All she had offered was her heart, tentative and trembling, and the children had accepted it, little by little. But she held her tongue, afraid her voice would betray too much. The boy ran past just then, the girl close behind, both laughing breathlessly. The rancher's gaze softened as he watched them, then returned to her. "That's why I asked you that question," he said, his voice low. "Not if you could work. I knew you could, but if you could be a mother." The words lingered between them like the hum of the crickets in the grass. She looked at the children, then back at him, and though she couldn't bring herself to answer out loud, her heart whispered the truth she was only just beginning to accept. She wanted to be, and for the first time in years, that hope didn't scare her. The creak of heavy boots against the wooden porch broke the fragile stillness of the room. The little girl perked up instantly, her freckled face glowing with excitement as she scrambled to her feet. "Daddy's home," she announced, her voice high and unburdened. She darted toward the door, her braid bouncing as she went, leaving the bride sitting alone in the firelight. The bride's heart leapt into her throat. Her hands tightened around the blanket, clutching it as though it were a shield. She had forgotten, for just a moment, that she was intruding in someone else's life. Panic rose in her chest. What would this man think when he saw her here, soaked, ruined, a stranger in his house? She should have left, should have run back into the rain before he arrived, but her body felt anchored by exhaustion. The door swung open with a groan. Cold air swept in along with the smell of wet earth and rain-soaked leather. A man stepped inside, broad-shouldered and tall, his presence filling the space instantly. His coat dripped from the storm, and his boots left dark prints on the wooden floor. He paused at the threshold, removing his hat and shaking off the rain, before his gaze swept into the room. And then he froze. His storm-gray eyes locked on the sight before him, a woman in a wedding gown, her veil discarded on the chair beside her, wrapped in a blanket and sitting near his hearth. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The fire crackled, the only sound between them. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. She felt her face burn with shame, her pulse racing so hard it made her chest ache. "Daddy, look." The little girl rushed back to his side, tugging at his hand with both of hers. She looked up at him, her face glowing with joy. "I found her in the rain. She's an angel. She came from heaven to see us." The man's expression flickered, some of the hardness in his eyes softening at his daughter's words, but not entirely. He crouched slightly, setting down his hat, and smoothed his daughter's damp hair with his large hand. "An angel, huh?" His voice was deep, roughened by years of use, but gentle when he spoke to the girl. "Yes," she insisted, her small hand pointing toward the bride. "She was all alone, and I brought her here. She was cold. I gave her a blanket and milk. She's ours now, right?" The bride's lips parted, but no sound came. She wanted to protest, to explain, but the words tangled in her throat. How could she tell this man the truth? That she had been abandoned at the altar, left like a discarded dress in the rain. The humiliation was too raw, too heavy. The man finally straightened, his gaze returning to her. His eyes studied her intently, scanning every detail, the ruined wedding gown, the streaks of mud along the hem, the tear-swollen eyes. There was no judgment in his stare, but there was no easy acceptance either. It was a careful look, guarded, as though he had built walls around himself that no stranger could climb. "You're hurt," he said finally, his tone low but steady. It wasn't a question, more of an observation. The bride swallowed hard, clutching the blanket tighter around her. Not hurt, she whispered, her voice unsteady. Just lost. The truth slipped out before she could stop it, and the admission cut her deeply, but she didn't take it back. It was the closest thing to honesty she could manage without unraveling completely. Something softened in his eyes then, something fleeting but unmistakable. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than she wanted him to. He walked past her to hang his coat by the fire, his movements steady, unhurried, as though giving her time to breathe. His daughter skipped back to the rug, humming a little tune, oblivious to the tension that filled the room like smoke. The bride's heart was still racing. She could feel the weight of his presence, the gravity of his silence. He was not a man who wasted words. But there was something in his stance, the way he carried himself, that told her he had known his share of sorrow. The girl looked between them, her face bright with determination. Daddy, she can stay, right? Angels don't have anywhere else to go. We should keep her. Her words sent a strange warmth through the bride, though she knew she should correct the child. She wasn't an angel. She was a woman discarded like unwanted lace, a heart split open, a soul adrift. But the girl's faith in her made her want to believe, if only for a moment, that she could be more than what she felt. The man glanced at his daughter, his expression torn between amusement and caution. Then he looked back at the bride, his gray eyes steady on hers. You're welcome to stay until the storm passes, he said finally. His voice carried no hesitation, only quiet resolve. The bride's throat tightened. Gratitude welled up in her chest so sudden and fierce that it nearly broke her all over again. She nodded, unable to speak. Her fingers twisted in the blanket, grounding herself in the reality of his words. The little girl clapped her hands, delighted, and curled up beside the fire once more. The man moved to pour himself a cup of coffee, his shoulders broad beneath his worn shirt, his movements strong but measured. He didn't press her with questions, didn't demand explanations. He simply gave her space, a gift she hadn't realized she desperately needed. Their eyes met again across the firelight, his gaze steady, hers fragile. In that moment, unspoken things passed between them, a recognition of pain, of loss, of walls built too high. And yet, beneath it all, there was a spark. Something fragile, tentative, a promise neither could yet name. The storm raged on outside, beating against the windows, but within the farmhouse there was warmth. The little girl drifted into quiet play, her voice soft like a song. The bride sat wrapped in the blanket, her heart still heavy but no longer shattered beyond repair. For the first time since the bells had rung that morning, she felt a sliver of safety. And in the eyes of the man across from her, she saw not pity, not judgment, but a guarded kind of respect. Perhaps even the faintest flicker of hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, in this small house, with a child's laughter and a stranger's quiet strength, she allowed herself to breathe again.